So I'll hand over to James to just give a sort of 5-minute introduction to where he sort of sits in what's going on in this area.
I'll try and do better than 5 minutes, but I think Tim would like me to just share our big data story, although listening to the other panellists this morning, I think we're more medium data. I don't think we get into the sort of trillions of records quite yet. So our business mobile optimizes 720,000 websites, and we do that by detecting the device that's coming onto the website, so the website can then optimize its response. And increasingly that technology is being used in order to understand what people are doing, so seeing what buying patterns vary by screen size, for example, with e-commerce. As a result of doing this, and it was a bit of a surprise to us, we ended up last month processing 1.3 billion unique web visits through our platform. And we now aggregate that information and provide it for free on our website, 51degrees.mobi. So as an example, I can tell you that in May, the HTC One, as far as share of web traffic, mobile generating traffic, surpassed the Z10 from BlackBerry and the Lumia 920 from Nokia, and is only narrowly behind the Xperia Z. Now, if you go back 60 days, the picture was completely reversed. So we've got fantastic insight into what's going on in this kind of medium data world. Our detection system is 99.9% accurate. We can process over 5 million detections per second, and we have 23,000 devices in the database. And that database is really being used to now help others drive their big data solutions, such as leading banks, mobile network operators, retailers, and publishers, where they plug this information into their analytics platforms and now get information that they didn't have before. So it really augments that, that big data for them. And of course, we don't just deal with those high-end customers, because we're an open source product and most of our software and data is open source. We can be used by anyone. So we have blogs about cats getting 20 uniques a month using our product as well. So that's our big or medium data story.
Thank you very much, James. So I'm going to kick off with a question before everyone else comes in. So for each of you, in turn, what do you see as the major issue in terms of the development of big data into the future? So is there something, we've heard this morning about the fact that big data is only going to get bigger in terms of the amount that's available. Is that a problem? Obviously, we can't stop that data arriving. So what are the issues from the point of view of OMA and other people in the sector as to how big data, how we can make best use of big data in the future? And what's the major issue in that development? So, James first, since you're at the centre.
I think it's not doing dumb things with it, which is, I guess, really to sort of Phil's point, making sure it's being used appropriately and the technologies are being integrated into the rest of the organisation. Just to give you an example of where dumb things are done at the moment, BT, British Telecom, sent through to me after 8 times, I think, these flyers saying upgrade your broadband, and I then decided to upgrade the broadband, and they then emailed me 2 weeks later to say, we've just cancelled your broadband because we can't actually provide it. And worse still, 2 weeks later, I got another letter come through asking me to upgrade to Infinity. So, there's still these sort of dumb things that businesses do, and I think the danger is that it just enables more dumb things.
Francesco.
Well, I can give the context in terms of smart cities and the use of big data in their context. And more than, let's say, talking about large volume of data, the challenge there is about the velocity of the data. So we talk about fast data more than it, because the challenge is really to have a large amount of data, but to process it also on the fly. And so the way we are dealing with the problem, for instance, is looking at streaming computing platforms, that are those platforms that are able to actually allow processing on the data on the fly. And that's, I think, it will be a way to somehow solve the problem of managing the data that is being created, because as we have experienced, not all the data is actually even worth to be stored in a database to be reused later on. So most of the data may be just required to be processed and aggregates or some statistics extracted, so summarized on the fly and then being used later on, but not all the data, but only what is actually useful in it. So in in our case, we are really focusing on how we can extract insight on the fly and use only that for processing.
Okay, Philip.
I'm going to disagree with you, if only because they'd like some disagreement up here, I'm sure. You're a technologist, and you just said the biggest challenge is the technology. I reckon if we didn't do any more on the technology, if we froze it right now, most of society, most organisations would still not have wielded it all to its greatest benefit by the end of the decade. There's a massive gap here between what's already possible technologically and the skills out there in the workplace, the legal framework. Our politicians' understanding of this stuff is dismal. They're the biggest challenges for big data going forward. When we've caught up with you, because your streak's ahead, once we've caught up with you, then the ball's back in your court and you can push us forward. That's what I reckon.
Thanks, Philip, for the disagreement. Tom?
I take a slightly different perspective, obviously coming from the measurement and quality, but I think if you look at big data and you segment my area, which is all about operators, what can you collect about users, I think it's different per segment. For example, engineering want everything, so a petabyte warehouse isn't big enough. If you then look at marketing, it's pretty similar. But I think the really important thing is the quality of the data, and I think the big thing about it is getting smarter about the information. So I'll give you an example. When you go into customer care, the example I just gave you, we throw most of the data away. And the reason is, the people in this room are not going to phone me as the head of the customer service in Vodafone and say, Tom, I had a fantastic experience today. You're just not going to do that. So if you had 6 or 7 sessions, you're going to phone up with the bad one. You're going to tell me about your problems. You're not going to tell me that the other 6 were good. So what we do is we get smarter about the data collection. So we don't feed those back. We can store them locally on the device. And when you get to a Wi-Fi hotspot in the evening, if engineering want that, bring it back. That's cool. But let's not clog up the communication highway between the end consumer and the user by bringing back huge amounts of data that have no value. It just makes no sense to me. Because if you can really start to focus with some intelligence, whether it's AI looking at trends and get smarter about it, I think that's a major area. And the second area that we bump into a lot is, I think we were speaking here about privacy. No matter what we do, when you go onto an end device, I'll give you an example again, Germany, Argentina, the privacy laws. We take MZs and we scramble it and we apply the technical guys 128, whatever SSLs, etc., and it's still not good enough because we bump into legal and we spend 6 months wading through legal agreements because the privacy and regulations are not clear. So I think those are 2 areas, Tim, for me.
Thanks, Tom. Ajit.
Okay. To me, I think the biggest gap is the interplay between big data and mobile. And I think that everybody agrees that there is something interesting here. But everybody also knows that depends on how you define mobile, whether it's operators, handset vendors, or things like that. There is certainly a gap to fulfill in getting its full potential. And specifically, I think I come originally, before I got into mobile, I used to be involved with data warehouses. So I understand the data warehousing concept pretty well, and data warehousing concept basically comes along to this idea of this mythical query, which is supposed to kind of solve all your problems. So all you have is a massive amount of data, and somebody decides this is one particular query which will get you a huge amount of money or something like that. And the question is, what is that query for mobile? So what is that single thing which we could, given all this data, which presumably we will have, what is that one thing which we could ask of that data? And maybe there is a role to create the skill sets for that, because I think that the current data scientist skill sets are quite distinct from the mobile requirements. So there is perhaps a place to create a mobile data scientist requirement of what that would be, because I think that is quite unique, as many of the panelists here kind of alluded to that problem as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Ajit. Mark?
Well, I suppose not surprisingly, I'm going to mention personal data and privacy. I think the biggest issue facing big data is the sustainability of the data pipeline. I think that pipeline is under threat, as I've said before, by being squeezed between regulation and hardening consumer attitudes. I completely concur with what Philip says about gaps, about the gap between technology, which is roaring ahead, and the skill sets which big data users actually have. And the same is true, obviously, with the legal gap, which is also being mentioned. And obviously, I would have to say there's a gap between big data users and the perceptions of consumers. So I think these gaps, I mean, it would be really convenient if we could press the pause button and everyone could catch up. That's not going to be possible, but then I guess one of the responsibilities of the OMA is to try to help in closing that gap and bridging it. And from my point of view, the consumer perception is the biggest gap of all, because I think they're only just finding out the amount of data that is actually being extracted about them, and I'm not sure they're that happy with it.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So, there are some questions that are coming in as we speak online, so carry that on. If you're watching the webinar, feel free to use the option at the bottom of your screen to add questions. But firstly, I'm going to just ask if there's a question from the floor. Is that a question? Yes. Alan.
Just general questions, and we see that a lot of data being collected. That's speaking for myself, when I go shopping, when I do internet search, when all these places in there. And at some point in my mind that this is overlapping, right? I think they already built a very good profile of myself, since I'm doing almost the same shopping, give and take. It's almost same buying habit or buying power. Any of this data is going to be saturated, and another big percentage of it's going to be almost useless, because the supermarket collect from me, my other supermarket collect almost the same data, and you start seeing correlation, and at some point they only probably need 50% of my shopping habit to predict. They don't need 100%. So how much of this big data is actually truly useful if I really mined it to what a percentage, if I could mine out of it, 20% or 100%?
Would you mind if actually, that's a great question, and actually it reminds me of a comment that Tom just made, and if I can try and link the two together. Because I'd refrain, Tom, when you said that don't bother to collect data that's not going to be useful. And you're just asking the same question in a slightly different way from a personal perspective. Why bother having all this data when a good swathe of it might not be useful? Or I only need a sample of it for statistical inference. The issue with big data is not that we collect it to answer questions. We have big data, and the challenge is not finding the answers, it's finding new questions.
Yeah.
So actually, by collating it all, we don't yet know what we might learn. And therefore, if I may be so bold, no one can answer your question.
Which kind of what I was trying to say as well was that the biggest significant thing is what is that one or two big questions which could give you a huge uptake in something. So I concur with that the question is finding the question.
Yeah. And if I could just finish, well, add to that, Senator Rumsfeld, or the Defense Secretary as he was then, was the one that can be quoted as using the unknown unknowns. And this is what, obviously, collecting big data when you're not quite sure what you're using it for helps you find the unknown unknowns.
I think our business were exactly like that. We started collecting data to improve web user experiences, and then 2 years later we found we could use that data for other things to help inform businesses and our clients about the devices that were accessing their site at aggregate level. We never set out to do that, it just happened.
Good, thanks. So one of the questions from online How can standards improve consumer willingness to share their data? If at all. Who wants to take that? Mark?
Yes, I mean, standards, I think, have the potential for improving the consumer's willingness to share data. The consumers are always more willing to open up and share their information if they trust the channel that they're sharing with. And I think any channel with well thought through standards can benefit by improving their perception, the consumer's perception of trust in them. Trust really is a new asset that we need to look into. Dare I call it big trust? Probably not.
I think you can take that to the next level with trust as well, because it comes down to convenience. If something becomes more convenient and someone trusts the party, then there's another reason for them to share. And I think the classic kind of most recent kind of case study for me is what Starbucks are doing with Square. So you just walk into Starbucks, the person on the till can see who you are because your phone has told the store who you are. They see a picture of you. They authenticate you by seeing the picture. And you don't have to do credit cards or anything like that. They know what you want from your previous preferences. It just becomes super convenient. And that outweighs all those other issues to do with privacy if you trust that part.
But isn't that a contradiction? Because that's not a standard at all. I mean, basically, it's Starbucks as a company and Square is a private enterprise. No standards playing at all. So people trust it.
In that particular implementation, and I think the way standards work is you don't start with the standard evolves and comes out of what people are actually using. So the fact that Starbucks invested in Square seem to have a very good trajectory at the moment, and they have now an opportunity to influence that standard, and if it works, then businesses are going to follow it.
But I think there's also a sort of a human element to this, which is building trust. Like any relationship takes a long time. So if you start looking at standardization, big data, what we're doing with it, you can get it right 99 times. If you get it wrong once, that once is pretty viral. It comes back. So I think there is a real need, and particularly with trust, we're back to privacy, we're back to legalities. Why can't we push our application to the mobile operator customers because we don't need the mobile operator? The answer is because their brands is much more trusted, and they will be their T's and C's and their legal aspects. The consumer will trust those, but they won't trust a small company who they have no idea who you are.
So one of the things, it's not just, from the point of view of this seminar, it's not just about standards. So you've got to think of, are there other things like recommendations, best practices, and other things that can help? So just on that sort of point, can you see a time when you could get a best practice from the point of view of legal, the legal terms and conditions, or the privacy type wording that you would get in a contract between different parties, the consumer and various companies? Could you see that happening?
I'll take that one. Personally, I can say yes, because we've got a few examples of that. But it takes, I think, a lot of transparency and openness, because what it really comes back to is, are you prepared to share with the consumer what you're collecting? And are they comfortable with what you're collecting? So again, it comes back to this trust, it comes back to openness, transparency. If you have an example where you're hiding something, or in our case, if our software was clandestine, where it's running in the background, it's root or whatever, that becomes incredibly negative. So you've got to be open, and you've got to share what you're doing, what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, and I think ultimately for the consumer, what's the benefit? Because I think you also have to look, I'm not an expert in consumer behavior, but if you look at age groups, I've got two daughters, and they've got a very different attitude to privacy than I do, because a lot of the questioning is, what's in it for me? And if I can get 20% discount, if I can get a coupon, if I can get a voucher, that's good, and I'm prepared to accept that. Whereas when you get a little bit older, you sort of think, well, I'm not so sure. So I think it's an evolutionary.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Brian? Oh, sorry. We'll take the question from you. Sorry, no. I didn't see your hand. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So I heard about analytics, usage of data, the amount of data, diagnostics of mobile experience, a lot of privacy concerns. the user has become the product. But if I think about the internet, that's the news of yesterday. So, okay, so there are mobile aspects now, but fairly the same issues that were about the internet and the data in the internet. Do you see anything new on the innovative side, technology side? I did notice the comment that we have maybe too much technology at the moment, but I'm interested to see if and learn if we have some innovative ideas like use of neural networks maybe to learn or data or mine the data, maybe semantic search or access to information, and I don't know, maybe other things.
Well, I think one of the things that's already happened with the mobile web is the accuracy of location. So if I go on my desktop computer, I'm based in the UK, I live in Reading. For some reason, if I go to a location aware website, it thinks I'm in Haywards Heath, which is near Brighton, about 100 miles away. With mobile, that location accuracy becomes so much more precise, to the point where the great case studies that talked about earlier are present. So although the underlying technology is the same, that accuracy change, I think, has already really shifted what you can do with the mobile web.
One more aspect relevant for us in OMA is any particular areas of fragmentation in the technology where maybe standards could help?
I think on the do not track side of things, do not track is a response to people who were suddenly alarmed by what was happening in the background. And it's a fairly awful execution. It's a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Effectively, I have two choices. I can abdicate everything, or I can put my hand up and say, no, you can't have any of it. And that's just not the way the world works. In terms of the value that your daughters might feel that they're getting from sharing stuff, that's granular control. That's a number of levers that I need to be able to move. And so, as the do not track evolution has stalled somewhat, what we will see is fragmented executions of that through different handset manufacturers, through different operators who are trying their best to navigate a path between annoying the end punter or failing to monetize them, neither of which is good for business. We must crack on and join the netheads, as I guess you could call them, to evolve do not track. And I would prefer it if user groups and technologists came together to do that with business than have us wait for politicians to do it for us.
Isn't there an opportunity for mobile network operators to take a more lead role in that discussion?
Oh, undoubtedly, definitely.
I think that's something that I was saying in my presentation, that there is an enormous opportunity for mobile operators to be the trusted privacy champion. They have the position in the value chain, in the repertoire in consumers' minds, the brands. Some of them are making mistakes, as we know, in the Houses of Parliament today, but let's hope that that's not too frequent. So yes, I do think that the mobile operators have an opportunity to help pull all those different things together. And I also agree with Philip about the DNT being very black and white as we speak. It's either have it on as default and block virtually everything, or it's not have it on at all. Obviously, at the moment, because the standard hasn't been completed in the States, there's a problem with any company actually accepting the headers, the DNT headers that are actually sent out into the network. And as we all know, Google have been penalised and fined for not honouring those messages.
So before we come on to Brian, I'm just going to ask a question from the web, which I think links in. So are there significant legal impediments to the broad consumer adoption of applications that use big data back-end databases?
Yes, there can be. I mean, the legal impediments are being tightened by the e-privacy laws in Europe, certainly. Europe tends to operate in a top-down way, as you know, because of the European government. And the US, as another example, tends to operate from bottom up, using standards to make sure that the industry is controlling itself. So there are differences across the world in how big data is being regulated. But you'll see on the one hand that if you look at your average mobile operator privacy policy, that they basically, and that's the standard contract of adhesion, they basically say we have these rights on your data, and if you sign up to that contract, then that is covered legally, and therefore that big data analysis is also covered legally. I have to say it's quite fuzzy as to what's allowed or not, and there's already been mentioned, you know, the consumer would probably be a lot more trusting if in those particular contracts they didn't say that service providers will be given the information, but actually said who it was. If you looked at the contract and you knew every single company that was going to get your data, then we might perhaps be a little more trusting rather than this very anonymous, we will share it with our partners, or we will share it with our service providers in the advertising industry, in government, you know, the whole thing is too shadowy for consumers to trust properly. So the answer to the question is that big data has still got issues legally, but a lot of them are covered by those very like it or lump it contracts that we all sign up to in our mobile contracts.
Thanks. Take the question from Brian.
Thanks. Brian Sullivan, AT&T. We are actually active in the W3C work on Do Not Track. I've got a couple of questions, and I'll mention something related to that. I heard earlier that the notion that service providers must not treat users as product, and I think that's a really good perspective to understand. I think as users, though, we need to understand that we are all the product, and that knowledge, in fact, is really our main source of power in the ecosystem as users. And once that realization is there, I think users begin to be engaged in the bargain that they're part of. For example, take user-generated content on the internet today. There's a whole lot of it. Users share socially, they share videos and everything. Okay, taking the user from the perspective of the product to the producer makes them an active participant in the ecosystem. And I think I'd like to get your thoughts as to how we can get users to elevate their role in the ecosystem and therefore take a little bit of the worry out of the use of data that they generate or is generated about them.
I think the language is really important here. I don't want to be over semantic or pedantic, but sometimes the very vocabulary that we use frames what we think is possible. So, for example, I hate the word user. It reminds me of someone who's reliant on hard drugs, right? Not so much the drugs bit, but the reliance aspect is something that we should have broken through with these kind of technologies. The individual that we used to call in the 20th century a consumer is no longer a consumer. So the consumer means once we've subjected that individual to some big statistical analysis and we've lumped them with a couple of thousand others to call them a demographic, they're a consumer. Their job is to consume our stuff. That's how it worked. As you quite rightly pointed out, that's not how it works now. In fact, those users are humans. And they aggregate in families, and in neighborhoods, in towns, in churches. And so actually what we're doing is we are liberating their ability to contribute the best value that they can, in the best way that they can, with the best group of people for them, their particular skill set, their capabilities, their knowledge. So I think that if we can just dump that 20th century vista of big organisation makes stuff for little man to consume, big government makes little rules for little man to obey, if we can actually flip that on its head, I think that's the true value of the technology that we're all building. Once you've got that in your mind, I think you can then start to frame your policies, your processes, your legal aspects in slightly different ways. You can just pick slightly different words, and then suddenly I think that you have more value in that expression than we would have done if we continued to use that 20th century terminology.
I also think there's some really good examples of businesses that made it really transparent how the money flows, and that's the problem with a lot of these things. Where the money is coming from isn't always clear for each of the parties. The business I'm thinking of is Ovum, who are a virtual mobile network operator in the UK, where you get reduced tariffs if you watch adverts. It's a very simple value proposition. It's easy to understand. You know when you're entering into it, and I think that transparency and understanding where the money is really helps.
Yeah, I mean, I think also again in my presentation around user-controlled personal data ecosystems, they're about not having perhaps all this duplication where Tesco's is collecting an enormous amount of information and Sainsbury's is collecting an enormous amount of information. My apologies for the use of British grocers as an example. But if we created a platform where we had personal data vaults with all the information that we wanted to share, including the personal identifiable information, but also all your preferences, what you like and what you want, then we'd be talking about information which is on record rather than being estimated by big data analytics. And I think that would put the user in control of their data, and also in many ways make the quality of the data that's being given a higher value even than perhaps targeted advertising is given. And I think that particular way of going about it with a user-controlled point of view or consumer-controlled point of view, indeed you call it a human-controlled point of view, because obviously a person is not just a consumer but is also a citizen, a neighbour, a dad, a mum, all these other different creatures that we are inside as well. And it's important to give all of those faces control over their personal data.
The book to read on this is The Intention Economy by Doc Searls. It just lays it all out beautifully. One hopes it's not just a utopian description, but one that we might actually build.
Okay, another question from the internet. For any panellist, can you list one or two of the most promising technical trends to make big data more persuasive and useful?
Well, from my personal experience, the cloud, being able to do stuff in Amazon and Azure, these cloud services is just fantastic. You don't have to buy infrastructure. It's just fast. It's made things possible that we weren't able to do before then.
From my angle, I think algorithms. I know that's not exactly a technology, but I think that's where a lot of value is going to shift.
And I'd add visualization, because only if, we're pathetic, us humans. We can only deal with 4 dimensions. These computers can deal with thousands. So if at any point we want to translate those dimensions into something we can sort of navigate Minority Report styley, we need some software to pick out the 4 most useful dimensions and then visualize those for us so that we can walk through them and, if you like, feel it at a visceral level as well as a cerebral.
So I'm going to ask another question here.
I think Kenny has a question.
Oh, okay, yeah. Kenny, sorry.
Kenny, Quality TNT. I'd like to direct the question probably to either Mark or Ajit. I'm sure you're familiar with the FIPS, the Fair Information Practice Principles. I mean, that is the result of at least close to 2 decades of analysis and convergence of policies supported by the Department of Homeland Security, FTC, WEF, and so on. And I feel that the yardstick is being moved around. It's being aggressively pushed toward even more severe, let's say, limitations of how business can be created while still respecting people's privacy. Do you see any observations? I tend to think so, because I've been to some of the discussions in the Internet identity workshops, and there are some very passionate arguments being set forward about any data generated belongs to the person and not nobody else. And they almost, companies will have to even have to, offer something in order to use that data. I mean, that's the other extreme, and you can see other analogies such as do not track and so on. The question is, do you see from a policy management point of view, a policy setting, whether the whole table is being turned against the traditional acceptability of managing responsibly use of people's data?
Oh, okay. I'll say something. I think that's a very good question. I think there is a change coming, but the way I see it is that it is not uniformly applied to many different areas due to the complexity of it. Now, if you give the telecom operator example, operators have a lot of data. They can collect a lot of data. They have collected it for a specific purpose, but they can't reuse the data for other things. But the irony is that on a mobile device, you can actually collect just about the same information, but at a different level of the stack. So you can, for example, Google can connect it using Google Maps and so on and so forth. The two don't have the same regulatory policy requirements. So if you actually are a mobile operator, you actually are constrained by some other historical regulation. But if you collect the same information in another way, on another part of the device, you actually don't. So I think that part of the problem in terms of where this shift is happening, I think, is that it is unclear to a lot of people what to regulate and how to regulate it. So I think that is one observation I make.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, to answer your question, that I think the trend is for, let's call them people rather than consumers and users, are becoming more powerful in the ecosystem. The old idea of sort of a patron company making the decisions for you and laying their stall out and saying, this is what we have and these are the rules at which you can have it, are changing. The possibilities are becoming a switch around where the people will actually say what it is, the rules at which they're going to engage with the service. And the services will have to either run with that or not get the business from the consumer. At the moment, it's the other way around. It's like it or lump it. You either use it and accept all of the very tiny, small writing that most people don't read, or you just don't take that service. So we have to say that people are becoming more powerful in the internet economy in relation to the way they were. So I do think that will impact the internet economy. I do think it will impact the way companies online do business, whether it's mobile internet or fixed. So that is something that companies will have to start working with and actually possibly looking into where the opportunities are for them in that respect, because there are some.
Okay, question from Brian?
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to the previous one. This is related to, one of our concerns with the do not track standard and the way in which, the user's involvement in making choice has been described. It, is very focused on the web browser. Okay, and what you can do through the web browser. But many of you probably up there have several devices, maybe several phones, several laptops, tablets, and use internet cafes, and et cetera. So if you say to users, we give you this power, but you've got to have to do it in this browser, and that browser, and that browser, and by the way, the 5 or 10 different WebView-enabled native apps that live on your device, et cetera. Each one of these things is going to give you control. You can go in and you can set who you want to share data with, who you allow to track you, who you trust, et cetera. I mean, is that really a choice? Is that really a control when it in fact is not going to be scalable? This is one of my concerns with the overt focus on this very narrow use case of a web browser, and one of the areas I think where standards could really play a key part. So I'd like to get your thoughts on the scalability of the user experience.
My answer to that would be that yes, it is a problem, because obviously we all increasingly use a number of different ways of accessing the internet via browsers, and we have more of them. But that actually is one of the reasons for creating what, for example, Doc Searls in his book Intentionality, or I've forgotten the name of it now, is it called?
Intention Economy.
Intention Economy. Talks about. He talks about the idea that the companies come to the consumer, so the consumer only writes once what his information is, or what his requirements are, or what his preferences are, and says and writes the laws, writes the contract in effect. In reality, it will be the consumer adopting an already off-the-shelf contract, or choosing from one of many. So that's the reality of it. But it actually means that in that instance, if that ecosystem did exist, then there wouldn't be the requirement to manage, all the different browsers, because that's not the way it would work.
I can only see it coming out of the browser. And interestingly, talking about semantics, what is a browser? The idea that you could just browse a read-only website is long gone. So companies like, organizations like Mozilla are actually questioning fundamentally what is the browser, how does it work. Everyone knows about the Firefox operating system that's emerging, HTML5 as far as you can get through the stack. It has to be really easy, and we haven't built that yet. But just because we haven't built that yet doesn't mean we should question the value of it. We just have to build it so that it is as easy as we want it to be. And whether the individual wants to set their preferences on the big screen in the living room, on the little screen on the bus to work, I don't mind. They just have to have one place that they choose where they can go and express their preferences. End of.
I wonder if technically virtual private networks, assuming bandwidth were infinitely fast, could solve the problem. So all your devices connect through the same sort of central point that controls your digital footprint to the outside world.
Architecturally, that does make me feel like we would be reversing some of the wonderful characteristics of the internet as it is architected today.
I agree.
Okay,
just yes. Putting it out there.
So following on from a question earlier about sort of complexity, so is there a risk, and I suppose this is for Francesco, is there a risk that when you get huge data sets and you're processing those data sets with complex algorithms, is there a risk that actually so few people understand the algorithms that the end result is believed by the people who see it, but actually only a very few people actually know what it really means, because so much processing is being done in the in the meanwhile?
Well, that's a challenge. I think the point he was making before about visualization is actually very important. So more and more there is a push on what is called visual analytics. So trying to express complex, result in a way that can be understood by, different type of either expert or the general public. And it's not only about visualizing the result, but also giving, let's say, the users of the tool also the possibility to browse between the different solutions and understand why, for instance, this complex algorithm is giving that particular recommendation, and not giving a, let's say, one result saying, okay, this is the way you need to deal with it, but also giving you, a list of potential solutions and explaining why, let's say, the big data is recommending that particular choice as opposed to the other. So it's more about what we call, on a technical term, is also communicating also the uncertainties in the results. So not only providing one solution, but communicating the fact that even if you have a lot of data and you have very complex algorithms, you are not going to find the optimal solution, but you want to give the feeling to the end user that there are several decisions still that he can make, and providing the feeling of which one is best for them or not. We have some experience, the work we are doing, for example, with cities, in which we need to recommend the traffic agency which choice they need to make in terms of traffic in the cities. And whatever big data you have, you don't have one solution that will solve all the problems. So you still want to communicate them give them the freedom to choose between different alternatives and providing some recommendation, but not solving the problem.
So linking into that, I mean, one of the things you often see in UK media in particular, and I'm sure it applies elsewhere, is a statistic. You get the phrase "damn lies and statistics." So with bigger data, do you get more big lies and statistics, and the media picking out the tidbits that are published, perhaps by research organisations or others, and actually giving more worry, and I suppose on the privacy angle, giving more worry to consumers about those results, because something's pulled out of a big data set as a specific item, it has a large variation, there's not certainty, but it's published as fact. And is that a risk and a problem?
I think it's a shocking risk. I think the media's understanding of statistics is about on par with the average Joe's understanding of statistics. We've only had to look at the media coverage of the climate warming debate, for example. We've just had the UK Met Office speak about their latest analysis of what can only be constituted as big data, massive data sets, and they've said this decade there won't be any warming. And then they said, but that shouldn't affect the long-term trend, that's just one of those things that happens. We still believe in man-made global warming. But of course, as soon as you say there's no warming this decade, whoa, then that's all we need, because we can then latch onto that one asset, forget the framing of that argument, and then the media can run with it. So I think those who publish the results of big data analyses have to be really careful. They have to work with a expert public relations professional in order to frame that very carefully, in order that people do not reach alternative conclusions or hyperbolic.
Yeah, but also in this context, I think we should look at what Guardian is doing in terms of the data journalism, because what they're doing essentially is publishing the data behind the result, and therefore it is transparent. People can make what it is. I think they are furthest ahead in this thing, but I believe others will do the same.
And the same in the academic world as well, rather than just publishing the paper, publishing the data sets behind it, and that can only mean that there's greater transparency, but that's still not quite how the media works. They want to sell papers or eyeballs. So, yeah, I think we might see some more red top alarmist headlines, Tim.
But I also think that it's unrealistic to think that it's going to be a perfect. Big data is never going to be the panacea. I mean, as we go through this evolution, it's going to take time. And I think some of the underpinnings are about trust, transparency, openness. The papers media will always pick on the exception, the Six Sigma. But I think what we've got to focus on is the value that we're bringing and hopefully that emerges over the next few years. But I think if we do have some bad examples, then you can take 3 steps forward and 10 steps backwards. It's not hard to reset.
Actually, just one last point on that. There are some interesting nuances. In terms of traditional market research, we used to analyze them with statistical techniques and reach statistically significant conclusions. Actually, one of the advantages of big data is we can look for weak signals that aren't yet statistically significant but might betray some future trends that we might be interested in. So in that detection of weak signals, we have to take great care in how to communicate those in order that people don't interpret that as a correlation in action.
But there again is a risk, which is there are open data sets. Somebody takes an open data set, they do their own research, and they come out with a result that says, as we mentioned yesterday, the growth in AIDS in Africa coincided with the
decline of the African elephant. It's a perfect inverse correlation, yes.
But I'm not necessarily convinced that the two
are not cause and effect.
Are related, yeah. So is there the potential? So on open data, do you think the increased number of open data sets is actually helping? Yeah, I suppose maybe on a research point of view, is helping you to build up bigger data and to correlate not just the data sets perhaps that you get, that you can gain privately, but that you can also correlate that with other data sets that are more public. And how would you use those?
Yeah, I mean, that's very, it's really what we are looking for instance, as well. The challenge, however, is that the more in the case, for instance, of cities are now, they are all looking at this open government and sharing their data. The challenge is how they don't really know how opening their data will impact, even privacy, because the more you open data, the more you leave the possibility to cross-correlate information, and so an agency that have their own, personal data could correlate with the open data and actually to identify people and so on. So the privacy law, they say that now they are pretty much focused on one in particular data set at a time. They are not really covering the problem related to when you are actually cross-correlating the data themselves. So from one side, it's great to open the data for, pushing to open new businesses and, new opportunity. From the other side, actually, there is more risk from a privacy standpoint that should be addressed.
And I think I'd also like to point out that, just a sort of quick anecdote. I don't know about other people in the room, but in terms of my maths education, my mathematics education when I was at school, when I was doing my calculus and I came up with the right answer and then wondered why I didn't get the full mark, it was invariably because I didn't show my workings. And I think this is something that companies and users of big data are going to start to have to think about. And I think they should apply their marketing departments to it. I think they will have to start using the great marketing skills they have, not just to promote their front-end proposition, but to defend their back-end, if you like, what's going on underneath, to defend their privacy policies and also to defend their black box algorithms. Get the professionals onto it and describe those black box algorithms in a way that the user understands. The companies already have those departments in their four walls. They should use them.
Okay, question at the back.
Yeah, Meanwhile, applied communication science. I got a question triggered by Mark's comments on the personal data exchange and some of the panelists' comments on end-to-end. So my sense is that there are going to be a lot of data, observed data, without users' consciousness being collected through the lot of end-to-end devices like, telematics. I have my driving habit basically known to the insurance company, and my living habit known to the smart grid companies. And And so that's beyond just the handset that some of the people talk about already. And, certainly from my point of view, say, if I want to have any kind of message pushed to my handset for kind of mobile advertisement or coupon, I don't want to, just go to the well-known site that I have to opt in for every site, every vendor site or every service provider site to kind of opt in. I hope that there's some mechanism that will also automatically discover my interest, not explicitly kind of specify my preference to every site, and I got the relevant information to me through some kind of automatic interest discovery mechanisms. And but all this data, I hope that I myself would have, just like Mark said, has some kind of vendor or service provider relationship management that will be, kind of have some kind of data analytics to serve the best interest of me. But, from each service provider's perspective, including most of the operators here or website service provider, content provider, I think in their view, this kind of mechanism might not be of best interest to them. So, so certainly I see the importance of the personal data exchange, but I'm not quite sure any standards, which standards body would be the best one to kind of provide that kind of standards for personal data exchange. And I put all my related data in medical, driving habit and all this stuff, the living habit into the, say, somewhere in the cloud. And whenever I have some information, it's all kind of crossed in there, and some kind of data analytics mechanism would help me to discover something I'm really interested in. And, I don't need to do the opt-in for anything, I'm really interested in. So that's just a question.
I think there's a standard that's already being used for something similar, which is authentication. So the open authentication standard, where you've got sort of Twitter and Facebook and Google, and you can sign into a website using your logins to those services. Now that's only sharing very limited information, not driving information and your preferences for coupons and all those kind of things. But it's there, it's being used by consumers, people, because it's convenient, and that might be the logical place to start.
So, Tim, could I just offer some information related to this?
Sure.
And that's the concept of personal cloud, which is very analogous to what you're describing as the data exchange, as well as the continuing on the Doc Seals work that was it James Phillip that mentioned in the book, that he actually has prototyping activities going on with intent casting. That's exactly your personalized RFP, RFI, and I think that those concepts, I'm pleasantly surprised that I'm hearing a lot of resonance from this panel, whereas prior, I tend to have a bit more skepticism about the kind of commercial potential of that. So I think it's a good correlation of different perspectives coming to the fore.
Thanks, Kenny. There's 2 minutes left, so in that 2 minutes, I'm literally just going to run straight through the panel and ask probably a simple question, but you have 20 seconds each to answer, and that is, how big is big data?
Well, it's an easy answer for me because I was at a Guinness-hosted pub event last night, and I was told the answer is 1 petabyte.
Ajit?
Well, the traditional answer seems to be that it's not, big data is data which doesn't fit very well into known databases. So I think that my answer would be that big data is never going to be big enough. You're going to be always going to find something more to add on to it.
Okay, Tom?
I think it's got the potential to be infinite because there's so much data available. I think the big challenge we have is what we do actually do with it.
Good point. Philip?
I think there are three characteristics of big data that come together in combination to differentiate it from just the medium-sized stuff. Firstly, it probably is in the petabytes. Secondly, it's big enough in order for complexity to be a characteristic of the data sets. In other words, for emergent behavior to be manifest. And thirdly, it generally means that 3 or 4 years ago we probably didn't have the technology to deal with it. If you have 2 or more of those, it's big data.
Francesco?
And I think the last piece I was mentioning before is really about the concept about speed of the data itself. It's not only big, but it's really dynamic
so it's
flow.
How quickly it's moving. Yeah. James?
So it's as big as time.
Okay, so I'm going to give a quick shout for Francesco, because he's actually on, from the presentation he had, he's got some demos that he can show you from the website that they've got. So if you're interested in seeing any more detail of the work that he's done, catch Francesco at lunchtime, sort of around there or over lunch. So thank you very much, and we will start punctually at 2 p.m. And so the webinar can commence for the people who are dialing in remotely. Okay, thank you.